Hi everyone, welcome to the next installment of the basic Fusion 360 tutorial. Today we'll be talking about the surface tools. So surface tools are excellent to create complex geometry with a lot of control over everything that you're doing and ultimately ending in a solid model. The surface tools you will find here under the design environment underneath the surface tab, and you'll notice that these tools have a different color than the solids tools. Solids tools have this blue color that differentiates them, and the surface tools have this orange color. So when you're doing something like, for example, searching to a tool by pressing the S key and getting to the search box, and if you search, for example, for the loft tool, you'll notice that you have both a surface loft and a solids loft. So that's pretty much the only thing that differentiates some of these tools, and you'll need to know that distinction along the way to avoid some headaches. So let's start by just playing a little bit with these tools that allow us to manipulate surfaces. So one thing you could do is you could actually use some of the same logic that you've used so far, for example, with lofting something. Let's say, let's create here surface to loft. I'm going to create a new sketch here on the bottom plane. And I'm just going to make sure that I don't create these objects snapped to anything. For example, if I snap these objects that I'm going to create to the origin, I'm going to have some trouble moving them, which is what I want to try with you today. So I'm going to create a couple of concentric circles. I'm going to the circle tool, and I'll just create some circles here of different diameters. And even doing this, for example, snapping here to the center and making them concentric, I am tying those circles together with a constraint. So I'll generate, three different sizes of circle. I'm not going to worry about giving these dimensions today. Now these are a bit tied together. So for example, if I select the Move tool by pressing M or going to Modify and Move Copy, if I try to move one of these in 3D space, I can't really make this into a 3D sketch because it'll move everything. Everything is tied together with a constraint. So one thing I can do is I can go and click on these items that I'm trying to move, and I'll see this constraint here. I can select the constraint here in the center, and I can delete it. So I just want to make sure that I have these objects, untied to each other. So let's see this outer edge. So now let's try selecting, for example, this circle here, and if I try to move this in 3D space, now I should be able to actually move this upwards. See, so I'm instantly within a single sketch creating different profiles that I can use for a loft. So now I can move this other object upwards. So let's say I want to create this sort of vessel type object here. I can do that fairly easily, and I can give this a dimension as well. If I want to make this a little larger, for example, I can give that a dimension too. Great, so now I have within the same sketch, I've turned this sketch into sort of a 3D sketch, if you will. So if I now go to the surface tools here, I can open the loft tool, and I can select these different profiles to create a lofted surface. And you'll see that it'll try to generate a surface that is very tangential and smooth as it can. And of course, you can create another line here for a guide rail within another sketch if you want to really guide this profile very exactly. One thing that you notice when I do a lofted surface is it is not a solid object. This is just the exterior surface. It does not create a filled-in object, and that's purposefully because we're going to actually do more operations to this before we turn it into a solid. So let's say, for example, I want to create a cutout here for this vessel. So I can actually create a new sketch. I'm going to create a new sketch here on this back panel, the back plane, sorry. And let's say I want to create here a cut here. I'm going to create a feature here on the side. I could simply go and create a circle, for example, that I'm going to use as a cutting tool. So let's say I want to cut this. I want to create this cut here for this intersection. So I actually don't need to create a surface to do any of these operations. I can use this line, this curve here, as a cutting object. So if I go to the surface tools, you'll notice that there's this tool called trim. So trim, when I select this tool, it's going to ask me to select a trim tool. And I can basically select any line, and it'll project this line outwards into space and extend a cutting tool. So you can see now the different areas that it's created. So I can actually see that these two areas of my object are now different areas that are selectable. So let's say if I select this area, I can basically get rid of it. I've trimmed this part here with this line. I can use a spline, I can use a straight line, I can use any object within a sketch to create this trim. Now, I can go ahead and patch these holes, for example, and there's this tool called patch. I'm just going to hide this circle sketch just for clarity. So a patch tool is going to create a surface in trying to fill a boundary. So if I, for example, select the patch tool and select this top area here, it's going to create a surface that's on top. I can do the same. I can right click and repeat this last tool, repeat patch, and I can create this boundary here. I'm going to create this new surface at the bottom, and these are still all separate surfaces, by the way. If you expand your bodies tab, you'll see that you have 3 different surfaces now for the outside wall, the top and bottom. And patch is going to try and create something that is as smooth as possible to that boundary. So, and it's often going to do a pretty good job. For example, if I choose patch and I select this boundary here, it's actually going to recreate tangentially that surface as good as it can. And this time around, it's pretty much a perfect match for what we had. So now we have this surface and that surface. That being said, if that's what I wanted to do, really, I can actually use a different tool here. So let me go back in time. I'm going to drag my timeline to before my trim. And by the way, you can drag this timeline to any point in time. And then you can, if you just want to go back a few steps and start from there, you can even right-click here and say delete all features after history marker. Okay, so if I had my sketch here with the circle, I can actually use this different tool here in the modify menu called split body. I can select the body to split, and then I can select the splitting tool, which can be either a surface or a line. And it's going to project this splitting tool. I can tell it to extend the splitting tool, which is what you're going to want to do if you're trying to cut through a large object. And when you click OK, it is going to separate those surfaces. So if you have something complex, creating a patch there is not going to cut it. You might want to keep this geometry on the one side and on the other, so you can also do that. And now I can do some work to this surface to create a little detail here. This surface, I can actually offset individual surfaces by going here to the Create menu and choosing Offset, selecting this surface, and now I can give it either a positive value to create a surface that is here in this direction, or I can give that a negative value and create a surface that is inside here. Maybe I'm going to go a little smaller, let's say -3. And it'll generate a new surface here on your tree, a surface that is offset from the original one. I'm going to remove this surface here, but if I just delete it, it's being referenced by other things in the timeline, so it's going to break a few things. So I can actually just right-click it, and instead of deleting it, I can just say remove, and it'll take it away from my tree. It'll take it away. Make it invisible, but it'll keep the data here for reference. So see, I've offsetted the surface here. And now if I want to actually fill this gap here, I can actually create a lofted surface between these two edges fairly easily. I can go to the loft tool and make sure that you're in the surface tab, and I can choose these outer boundaries as profiles. And I'll create a lofted surface between them two that fills this gap to create this nice detail. Right? And I can start fusing these surfaces together. For example, if I go to the stitch tool here, it'll allow me to stitch different surfaces that have meeting edges into a single object. So I'll go to stitch, and I'm going to draw a selection window here around all of these surfaces, or you can select them from the tree as well. And it'll mark these edges in different ways. So anything that is red is going to be an open edge that's not going to be stitched to anything. So if there's a gap that's too large, it's not going to try to stitch it. And all the green edges are the edges that are going to get stitched by this operation. Now, if you have parts that are sort of meeting together, but you can't get those to be 100% exact, the stitching tool can help with that sometimes. You can change the stitching tolerance up and down and actually tell it to try to bridge those gaps, and it'll try to modify those surfaces accordingly. It's not a foolproof thing. Sometimes it'll throw an error depending on how big or irregular the gap is, but it's often pretty successful. So I'm going to click OK, and now you'll see that these 3 surfaces that I had were joined into a single object. And now you can start applying solids tools to edges that are here. For example, I can apply a fillet by pressing F or going to the fillet tool, and I can select these and, for example, give these a radius. I gave these a 1.5 millimeter radius, and you see that I've created this really nice inset area or feature here on my vessel. And now I can take further steps to turn this into a solid model. I can go into, let's say, the patch tool, and I can create, again, boundary fills for these top and bottom portions. And now I can go ahead and use the stitch tool again. Now, whenever you use the stitch tool and you choose objects that ultimately generate a closed object or a solid object, once you click OK, you'll see that these surfaces are going to get stitched into a solid body. Now, this is a body that has thickness. If you go ahead and do the inspection tool and use a section analysis and you choose whichever axis you want, you can actually see that this now is a solid object. So anytime you do a surface stitch and you've created an enclosed area or a solid object, it'll be generated automatically. And now you can continue applying solids tools to this. That was, this was built entirely out of surfaces, and you have a lot of control over these individual surfaces. And now you've turned it into a solid, and you can apply solids tools to it. For example, you can shell this object now. And you generated a shelled object here, and you can keep refining it. I'm going to add a fillet, for example, here to this edge. And now I have a finished object. Now, you can keep using your surface tools to continue working on this part, and you can go back and forth between a solid and all the surfaces, because you can break down an object here in the surface panel by using the unstitch tool. So you can unstitch any body, even if it was created with surface tools or not, it doesn't matter. And you can unstitch it into all of its individual components and also use those for different things. I can, for example, take this surface and I can create a copy of it, or I can move it away. You can see that I've broken down this object into all of its different components, and now I could potentially use this surface to create something else. For example, I could try and thickening the surface, and this will actually turn any individual surface into a solid model. And sometimes this will work, sometimes it will fail. It's quite a resource-intensive operation. So you go to thicken, and you can say I want to thicken this object by a certain amount, and this is going to result in a new body. So here I've thickened it by 2 millimeters. I click OK, and I've created this part here that is a solid object that's been thickened. So let's say I wanted to create a silicone jacket for this object. I can go ahead and grab that outer skin, and I can create a new object based on it. So you can go back and forth, copy things, move them around, use them as cutting tools, use them as tools to be cut. There's really a lot of flexibility in what you can do with all the surfacing tools. And surfacing tools are great things to create very irregular, complex geometry and complex curvature. So let's say I wanted to create a very complex surface. I can actually do that in a very controlled way. You can, of course, create different profiles that represent different parts of your object. I can, for example, create a set of splines here. And these splines can all have different varied geometry, varied curvature. I'm going to repeat this operation. These could represent all different sections of an object. This could be closed boundaries, or they could be open boundaries, just like this open spline. I can move these objects around in 3D space as long as they're not constrained to each other. And I can go ahead and go to my surface tool here and create a lofted surface between these. I could create guide rails if I wanted to have way more control over this complex curvature. And see, just by using just open curves, open lines, I've generated this object that is of quite complex curvature. And again, this is parametric. You can go back and edit a sketch that you made. And let's say I wanted to have profiles that were not completely flat. I can actually move parts of a spline into 3D space. And I can finish sketch here, and the object will get rebuilt. So you can just imagine the possibilities of this tool. We can continue playing with this. We can trim the surface down into something. We could say, let's create a new sketch here on this face, and I can create the section of solid object that I want to cut from this. Again, I could use a circle. And now I can go back to my surface tab, and I can say trim, and I can choose this new circle as my trimming tool. You see it'll get projected. And then I can choose either to keep the inner boundary or the outer boundary of this surface. In this case, I'm going to trim the outer boundary, and I'm going to say OK, and it's going to just keep this one surface here with this really complex geometry. I could thicken this surface and turn it into a solid to use this object for something. Here, let me hide this sketch here. Or I can go ahead and for example, try making a copy of this object. I can select it with the Move tool. I can say Create Copy. I can click on Create Copy before I start moving it. So I can create a clone, and I can move this clone in whatever way I choose. I can place it in any orientation that I'd like. And then I can attempt to create an object from this. I can say create a lofted surface, and I can again just choose two different boundaries, and see this will attempt to create a lofted surface here. Now here I think I might have a pretty funky result because these parts are really offset from each other. So you can see I have some self-intersection here in these yellow areas between the front and back faces. Now this is something that I wouldn't be able to stitch into a solid until I correct this, but it might be just a matter of moving these into a better location. Yeah, so that solves that self-intersection. Very complex geometry that would be very hard to create with any other tools. And I can go ahead and stitch these surfaces together now. All the green lines, everything's going to get stitched. I can click OK, and I've turned these very irregular surfaces into a solid body that I can keep refining. I can cut into with an extrude tool. I can 3D print or machine this object. I can apply things like a fillet to these edges. I can go ahead and merge this into another solid object with a combine tool. I can really do many things. Another important thing to mention is you can create surfaces here in the Create Form tool. So I'm going to go and insert a form into my tool, into my environment. I'm going to select the origin here and select the base plane, and then I'm going to create a cylinder. So I'm going to drag this cylinder out, and you can insert reference material to help you guide yourself to be able to do this. I'm going to drag this out to be a little higher. I'm going to select mirror symmetry for this one object. I think it might be length symmetry what I want. I can see the symmetry line here, so any changes that I make to one side are going to be made to the other side. And I'm going to click OK. So you see that I've created a form, but this form is actually a surface. It's not a capped surface. It's not a capped object. So I can go ahead and modify this. For example, I can say edit form. I can select edges. I can double click to select a ring here, and now I can use things like my scaling tool to help me achieve the form that I want. And again, I could use reference such as sketches inserted into a canvas to give me reference. So I like that quite a lot. I can actually go and edit this a little further. If I don't want a circular profile, I can actually thin this a little bit. So maybe I want more of elliptical profile here. Great. So I can pretty much use the very flexible form tools to sculpt this into shape. And when I finish this form, I actually get a surface as a result. Now I'm going to work on this surface a little bit more. So I'm actually going to get rid of half of this surface in order to be able to work on it more efficiently. So I'm going to create a new sketch here on the front view, and I'm just going to create a line to help me slice this object in half. So I'm just going to create a line here in the right plane, and I'm going to head to my surface tab, and I am going to use the trim tool. So the trim tool now here is going to be this line object, and depending on which plane you created this line, the orientation of this cut's going to be a little different. So you can see it's going towards the view of the plane that I chose to sketch this on. And now I can actually delete one side of the surface. Select it, click OK, and it gets trimmed by this line. So now I have half of this object. I can go ahead and insert a new sketch here on my center plane. And I'm going to create a little handle for this jar. Maybe it's like a laundry detergent container or something similar, or maybe a pitcher. So I'm going to create a new ellipse, and this ellipse is going to represent the hand hole for the form that I'm creating. So I'm going to insert an ellipse here, and I'm going to give it whatever size, and then I can actually go ahead and click Escape to get out of this tool. And I can drag these elements along here, all these quadrants, to suit exactly what I want from this shape. All right. As soon as I'm happy with it, I'm going to create a second outline, which is going to determine this outer boundary for the handle that I'm going to cut, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So I'm going to create a new spline here, and I'm going to draw a spline that goes a little bit around here. By the way, if you're snapping to stuff that you don't want, you can hold the Command or Control key to disable snaps as you're drawing. I usually find this useful when I'm creating any kind of freeform drawing, particularly with splines. So instead of just cutting an extrusion out of this object and just creating a handhold that is not very ergonomic, I'm going to try to attack this cut in a different way. So I've drawn, and you can of course control this shape by clicking on these different control points, or actually dragging the handles on control points to really refine this line. And once you're happy with it, you can click Finish Sketch, and let's cut this object up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the Trim tool. The Trim tool is going to be this boundary that I just drew outside my handle. And I'm going to get rid of this inner portion of the outer surface. So OK. Now I've cut this surface here. So maybe you see where I'm going with this, but now I can create a new lofted surface between these two. I'm going to select the ellipse here, and then now I'm going to select the outer boundary that I drew, and it's going to create a transition surface for my handle. And again, I can come back with the stitch tool, for example. I can stitch surfaces together. You can do this at any point. Maybe it's something that you want to leave as a last step, and you can say, I want to see if I can fillet this cut. And you can really control the surface by using surface tools as opposed to other solid modeling tools. It just gives you pretty much unlimited control over every aspect of these surfaces. This loft that I created here, I could have created this loft as well with a guide rail that gave it a curvature. Yeah, the possibilities are quite interesting. Let's add another little feature here. Maybe I want to add a small detail that's just a visual detail that adds something to this form. So I can perhaps draw a new sketch here on this plane, and I can go ahead and, for example, project. I'm going to hit the letter P to go to my project shortcut. I can project perhaps this line here, and I can offset this line now that I projected. I can go and offset it again. Of course, you can give this exact dimensions depending on what it is that you're trying to do. So now what I want to do is I want to cut this surface away. So I'm going to go to the modify menu here in, modify menu here in my surface tab, and I'm going to say split body. The body to split is going to be the large surface I'm working on, and the splitting tools are going to be these new two curves that I've created here to create a cut. So now I've split this into a couple of different surfaces here, and I actually want to get rid of this one. I'm going to right click it and say remove. And I've created this gap here that I want to fill. So I'm going to create a new sketch here on my center plane. And now I can go ahead and project these curves here into my active sketch just to give myself a reference to sketch on. I can say project, shortcut P, select these two lines, and I'm going to draw an arc between these two. So say it's a 3-point arc, and maybe I want to create a little bead, for example. That looks pretty good. I'm going to say finish sketch. And now I'm going to go ahead and do a sweep of this profile. I'm going to head to the create menu here and make sure that you're in the surface, in the surface tab. Go to sweep, and then the type of sweep is going to be a path plus guide rail, because we have two references to adhere to, these two lines. So path plus guide rail. So the profile is going to be, in here we're going to uncheck chain selection because we want to choose individual sections of this line, this profile here. And then I'm going to select the path. I select one of these. And then I'm going to go to guide rail and select the other one. And this is going to create a sweep of this form along the path. So here you can see that it hasn't gone completely all the way. This is sometimes something you have to plan for. You have to extend that surface a little bit and then cut it down, because often switching this to full extents will mess up with the scaling of your path here. You can see that it doesn't really do the result, give you the result that you want. Neither does the stretch profile scaling. So I'm just going to go with none and with with scale, and I'm going to say perpendicular to path, and that's fine because I actually want to do a last operation to this. So I've generated this nice bead feature here on the surface that would be pretty tricky to create with any other operation. Now I can go ahead and create a final profile to cut here. So I'm going to create a new spline at the top. Just give myself a nice curve here for the front of this vessel. And again, go to surface, say trim. I'm going to use this as a trim tool. And I can go ahead and select all of the parts that I'm going to get rid of with this trim operation and click OK. And I'm going to actually hide this last sketch just for clarity. And now I'm going to mirror my form about. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch these surfaces together. So I go to the stitch tool. I select all these surfaces. I can see the ones that are going to get welded. into a single surface. And now I can go to the Create menu, select Mirror to mirror a copy of this. The pattern type is going to be bodies. I'm going to select this body as the object to copy, and then I'm going to go to Mirror Plane and select this plane to mirror about. And I've created the other side of this vessel. And I can again come back to the stitch command if I want and actually stitch these two together. I can go to the patch command and give this a bottom. I can attempt creating this patch. This might give you an irregular result sometimes if this bead it's not completely straight. It looks pretty smooth here. And now I can fuse all of these together into a solid again with the stitch tool. And now all my bodies have become a solid object. Let me attempt a shell here. Select this face. Give this a 2mm shell. And again, shell operations are very tricky, and they can work or they can not work a lot of the time. Excellent. So I don't know the exact purpose of this vessel. I just wanted to play around with all these surface tools and add some interesting complex geometry to this with you. So I hope you're able to follow this tutorial with me, and I'll see you in the next installment. Bye-bye.